It was 3:47 a.m. on a rainy Thursday when Victoria Hayes heard the commotion outside St. Mary's emergency department. As the night shift charge nurse, she had seen everything during her 15 years at the hospital. Overdoses, car accidents, heart attacks, and domestic violence victims. But something about the urgency in the paramedic's voice over the radio made her prepare for something serious. Incoming male, approximately 60 years old, found unconscious in downtown alley, possible cardiac event, ETA 3 minutes. When the ambulance doors burst open, Victoria saw the paramedics wheeling in a disheveled man in expensive but now ruined clothing. His suit jacket was torn, his white shirt stained with mud and blood from a head wound, and his Italian leather shoes were scuffed beyond recognition. He was unconscious, pale, and barely breathing. The paramedics reported finding him collapsed behind a dumpster near the financial district, with no identification and no witnesses to what had happened. Victoria immediately took charge, her training and experience guiding her through the critical first moments. She checked his vitals, started an IV line, and began the systematic assessment that could mean the difference between life and death. His pulse was weak and irregular, his blood pressure dangerously low, and his breathing shallow. Whatever had happened to this man, he was fighting for his life in ways that money and power, if he had either, couldn't help him now. As Victoria worked to stabilize the mysterious patient, she noticed details that suggested he might be homeless or destitute. His expensive clothing was so dirty and damaged that it looked like thrift store cast-offs, and his appearance suggested he hadn't bathed or eaten properly in days. She felt the familiar surge of compassion that had driven her to become a nurse, seeing not a successful businessman, but a human being in desperate need of care and dignity. In the emergency room, everyone was equal, rich or poor, powerful or forgotten. Everyone deserved the same level of dedicated medical attention. Victoria Hayes had dedicated her life to nursing, not for the modest salary or difficult working conditions, but because she genuinely believed that caring for others was her calling. At 42, she was a single mother, raising 2 teenage children on a nurse's income, often working double shifts to make ends meet, while maintaining the high standards of patient care that had earned her respect throughout the hospital. Her colleagues knew they could count on Victoria to handle the most challenging cases, with both medical expertise and genuine human compassion. The unconscious patient in bed 7 became Victoria's primary focus as the night progressed. She monitored his vital signs every 15 minutes, adjusted his medications based on his responses, and carefully cleaned his wounds while maintaining his dignity despite his disheveled condition. When he began showing signs of pneumonia, likely from exposure to the cold rain, Victoria advocated for aggressive antibiotic treatment, arguing with residents who suggested that a homeless patient might not warrant expensive interventions. During quiet moments between other emergencies, Victoria sat beside the mysterious man's bed, talking softly about his progress and encouraging him to fight for recovery. She had learned that unconscious patients often could hear and respond to human connection, even when they couldn't communicate. She told him about the beautiful sunrise visible from his window, described the dedicated medical team caring for him, and assured him that he was safe and that someone cared about his recovery. Victoria's personal experience with hardship made her especially sensitive to patients who appeared to be struggling financially. She remembered her own difficult years as a newly divorced mother, when a medical emergency could have meant financial disaster. She saw dignity in every patient, regardless of their circumstances, understanding that illness and misfortune could strike anyone at any time. Her ability to provide compassionate care without judgment had made her one of the most respected nurses in the hospital, though she remained humble about her contributions to patient recovery. By dawn, the mysterious patient's condition had stabilized somewhat, but he remained unconscious and in critical condition. Victoria had worked through the night, coordinating with doctors to adjust his treatment plan and monitoring his responses to various interventions. The combination of cardiac irregularities, head trauma, and developing pneumonia created a complex medical challenge that required constant attention and expert nursing care to prevent complications that could prove fatal. Dr. Martinez, the attending physician, was impressed by Victoria's thorough documentation and proactive interventions throughout the night. She had anticipated potential problems, caught early warning signs of complications, and provided the kind of detailed patient advocacy that could make the difference between recovery and tragedy. Her notes were comprehensive, her observations astute, and her recommendations based on both medical knowledge and intuitive understanding of patient needs. The social worker assigned to the case had made preliminary inquiries about the patient's identity, but without identification or anyone reporting him missing, they had little to work with. Victoria suggested checking with local homeless shelters and social services, assuming that someone from that community might eventually inquire about a missing person. She had seen too many cases where society's most vulnerable people suffered medical emergencies with no family or friends to advocate for their care. As Victoria's shift neared its end, she found herself reluctant to leave the mysterious patient. Something about his condition and circumstances had touched her deeply, perhaps because she recognized the vulnerability that could strike anyone when health and fortune failed simultaneously. She provided detailed notes for the day shift nurse, emphasizing the need for continued vigilant monitoring and patient advocacy. Before leaving, she stopped by his bedside one final time, adjusting his blankets and quietly promising that the staff would continue providing excellent care during his recovery. Victoria returned home to her small apartment, exhausted but satisfied that she had provided the best possible care for a patient in desperate need. She helped her 16-year-old daughter Sarah with homework, made breakfast for her 14-year-old son Michael, and tried to catch a few hours of sleep before returning for another night shift. Her modest lifestyle reflected the financial reality of single parenthood on a nurse's salary, but Victoria had taught her children that wealth was measured by the ability to help others, not by material possessions. That afternoon, Victoria was awakened by her daughter's excited voice from the living room. "Mom, you need to see this news story," Sarah called. "They're talking about some missing billionaire who owns half the companies in the city." Victoria stumbled to the television, still groggy from insufficient sleep, to see a breaking news report about the mysterious disappearance of Marcus Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries and one of the wealthiest men in America. The news showed recent photographs of Sterling at corporate events and charity galas, looking polished and powerful in expensive suits. But as Victoria studied the images, a shocking recognition dawned on her. Despite the clean-shaven face, perfectly styled hair, and confident expression in the photos, she was looking at the same man she had spent the night caring for in the emergency room. The homeless-looking patient in bed 7 was actually one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. The news report detailed Sterling's reputation as a ruthless corporate leader who had built his empire through aggressive takeovers and cost-cutting measures that often resulted in massive layoffs. Former employees described him as cold, calculating, and completely indifferent to the human cost of his business decisions. The contrast between this fearsome public image and the vulnerable, helpless man Victoria had gently cared for throughout the night was stunning and deeply troubling. How had one of America's most powerful men ended up unconscious and alone behind a dumpster? Intrigued by the revelation of her patient's true identity, Victoria spent her afternoon researching Marcus Sterling's recent history through news articles and business reports. What she discovered painted a picture of a man whose empire had been crumbling in recent months due to a series of catastrophic business decisions and personal scandals. Sterling Industries was facing multiple federal investigations for financial irregularities, environmental violations, and worker safety violations that had resulted in several deaths at company facilities. The articles revealed that Sterling had been increasingly erratic in recent weeks, making bizarre public statements and appearing disheveled at board meetings. Several major investors had withdrawn their support, creditors were calling in loans, and the company's stock price had collapsed by over 80% in just 6 months. Industry analysts predicted that Sterling Industries would declare bankruptcy within days, taking Marcus's personal fortune down with the corporate collapse. More disturbing were reports of Sterling's deteriorating mental health and suspected substance abuse problems. Former associates described a man who had become paranoid, isolated, and increasingly unstable as his carefully constructed world fell apart around him. His wife had filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order. His adult children had publicly distanced themselves from his business practices, and even his most loyal executives were abandoning the sinking corporate ship. The final piece of the puzzle came from a security camera report that had captured Sterling leaving his downtown office building Tuesday evening, walking aimlessly through the financial district in the rain. He had been drinking heavily, according to witnesses at several bars, and had been seen arguing with himself while stumbling through increasingly dangerous neighborhoods. The powerful billionaire, who had once controlled the lives of thousands of employees, had become a broken man with nowhere to turn and no one who cared about his welfare. Armed with knowledge of her patient's true identity, Victoria returned to the hospital that evening with mixed emotions. Part of her felt sympathy for anyone who had fallen so far and so hard, regardless of their previous actions. But another part of her struggled with caring for a man whose business practices had reportedly caused so much suffering for working families like her own. She had read about Sterling Industries layoffs that had devastated entire communities, environmental damage that had poisoned children, and safety violations that had killed workers whose families probably earned in a lifetime what Sterling spent on a single business lunch. When Victoria entered the ICU, where Sterling had been transferred, she found him still unconscious, but showing signs of improvement. His vital signs had stabilized, the pneumonia was responding to antibiotics, and the swelling from his head injury was gradually decreasing. Medically, he was progressing well, though the doctors cautioned that recovery from his combination of injuries and apparent substance abuse could take weeks and might leave him with permanent cognitive effects. The night shift supervisor, aware that Victoria had been the primary nurse during Sterling's admission, assigned her to continue his care. As Victoria reviewed his chart and examined her patient, she found herself looking at him differently now that she knew who he was. The expensive clothing that had seemed like thrift store cast-offs now appeared to be designer garments ruined by his fall from grace. The man she had seen as vulnerable and deserving of compassion was also responsible for decisions that had destroyed countless lives. Despite her conflicted feelings, Victoria's professional training and personal ethics demanded that she provide the same excellent care she would give any patient. She checked his medications, monitored his responses, and continued the gentle bedside manner that had characterized her nursing throughout the previous shift. Whatever Marcus Sterling had done in his business life, he was now a sick and vulnerable human being who deserved medical attention and basic human dignity during his recovery. As the night progressed, Victoria found herself in an internal battle between her natural compassion and her knowledge of Sterling's destructive impact on working families. She thought about her own financial struggles, working multiple shifts to provide for her children, while executives like Sterling earned more in an hour than she made in a year. She remembered news stories about Sterling Industries employees who had lost their jobs right before Christmas, families who had been evicted when the company moved operations overseas, and communities that had been devastated by plant closures designed to maximize Sterling's profit margins. During a break, Victoria called her mother, needing someone to talk through her conflicted feelings. Her mother, a retired nurse who had worked in charity clinics, serving the poor, listened patiently as Victoria described the situation. "Honey," her mother said finally, "nursing isn't about judging whether people deserve our care. It's about recognizing that everyone is someone's child, someone who has made mistakes and suffered consequences. Your job is to heal, not to punish." The conversation helped Victoria refocus on her core values and professional obligations. She had become a nurse to help people during their most vulnerable moments, not to serve as judge and jury for their past actions. Sterling might have been a terrible person in his business dealings, but he was also a human being fighting for his life, alone and powerless in ways he had probably never experienced. His current suffering didn't erase his past wrongs, but it also didn't disqualify him from receiving compassionate medical care. Returning to Sterling's bedside, Victoria resumed her careful monitoring and gentle care, choosing to see the patient rather than the public figure. She adjusted his positioning to prevent bed sores, monitored his neurological responses for signs of improvement, and continued talking softly about his progress and the medical team's efforts to help him recover. Her decision to provide excellent care despite her personal feelings represented the best of nursing professionalism and human compassion working together. Near midnight, Victoria noticed the first signs that Sterling might be regaining consciousness. His eye movements had become more purposeful. His breathing patterns suggested lighter sleep rather than deep coma, and he was beginning to respond to gentle stimulation with small movements and facial expressions. She immediately contacted Dr. Martinez, who confirmed that Sterling's neurological signs indicated potential awakening from his unconscious state. Over the next 2 hours, Victoria monitored Sterling's gradual return to consciousness with a mixture of medical interest and personal apprehension. As he began to stir and attempt to open his eyes, she found herself wondering what kind of person he would be when fully awake. Would he be the arrogant, demanding billionaire described in news reports, or would his recent experiences have changed him in fundamental ways? How would he react to finding himself in a public hospital, dependent on the care of working-class medical staff? When Sterling's eyes finally opened and focused on Victoria's face, his first expression was one of confusion and fear. He tried to speak, but could only produce weak, hoarse sounds due to the breathing tube that had recently been removed. Victoria immediately began the gentle reassurance that she provided to all patients awakening from serious medical events, explaining where he was, what had happened, and assuring him that he was safe and receiving excellent care. Sterling's first coherent words were, "Where am I?" followed quickly by, "What happened to me?" Victoria provided basic information about his medical situation while avoiding mention of his identity or the circumstances of his discovery. She explained that he had been found unconscious, had suffered some serious medical problems, but was now improving and would likely make a full recovery with proper care and rest. Her professional demeanor remained calm and reassuring, treating him exactly as she would any other patient awakening from a traumatic medical event. As Sterling became more alert throughout the night, Victoria witnessed something she hadn't expected: genuine vulnerability and confusion from a man who had built his reputation on strength and control. He seemed genuinely bewildered about how he had ended up in the hospital, remembering only fragments of the events leading to his collapse. When he asked about contacting his family or business associates, his voice carried uncertainty rather than the commanding tone she had expected. Sterling's attempts to assert control over his situation were weak and ineffective, revealing just how far he had fallen from his position of power. When he asked Victoria to call his office, she gently explained that it was the middle of the night and that his primary focus should be on recovery rather than business concerns. His frustrated attempts to demand special treatment or private accommodations were so feeble that Victoria felt more pity than annoyance at his behavior. What surprised Victoria most was Sterling's apparent gratitude for the basic medical care he was receiving. He thanked her repeatedly for simple nursing tasks like adjusting his pillows, bringing him water, and explaining his medications. His appreciation seemed genuine rather than manipulative, as if he truly hadn't expected to receive competent, compassionate care from hospital staff. The man who had once controlled billions of dollars was now grateful for a warm blanket and a kind word from his nurse. As dawn approached, Victoria found herself reassessing her initial judgments about Sterling's character. While she couldn't forget his documented history of harmful business practices, she was seeing a broken, frightened man who seemed to have lost everything that had once defined him. His current humility and dependence might be temporary results of his medical crisis, but they were also revealing aspects of his humanity that his wealth and power had previously hidden from public view. During the quiet hours before dawn, Sterling surprised Victoria by asking personal questions about her life and work. He seemed genuinely curious about her experience as a nurse, her motivation for choosing such a demanding profession, and her perspective on caring for patients from all walks of life. His questions weren't the superficial small talk she might have expected from a wealthy executive, but rather thoughtful inquiries that suggested real interest in understanding her worldview. Victoria found herself sharing more than she usually did with patients, perhaps because Sterling's current vulnerability made him seem more approachable than his public reputation suggested. She talked about her children, her struggles as a single mother, and her belief that everyone deserved excellent medical care, regardless of their ability to pay. Sterling listened intently, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was truly engaged with her perspective rather than simply making conversation. When Sterling asked why she had chosen to work at a public hospital rather than pursuing more lucrative opportunities in private healthcare, Victoria explained her commitment to serving patients who had nowhere else to turn. She described the satisfaction of helping people during their most vulnerable moments, regardless of whether they could afford premium medical services. Her passion for nursing and patient advocacy was evident in every word, and Sterling seemed genuinely moved by her dedication. The conversation revealed aspects of Sterling's personality that contradicted his public image as a cold, calculating businessman. He spoke thoughtfully about his own isolation and loneliness, admitting that his pursuit of wealth and power had cost him meaningful relationships with family and friends. His recent business failures had stripped away the superficial connections based on his money and influence, leaving him completely alone when he needed support most. For the first time in years, he was having a genuine human conversation with someone who knew nothing about his wealth or status. As Victoria's shift ended and the day nurse arrived to take over Sterling's care, she found herself reluctant to leave her patient. Despite learning about his controversial past, she had developed a sense of protective concern for the vulnerable man who bore little resemblance to the fearsome billionaire described in news reports. His gratitude for her care had seemed authentic, and his interest in her perspective suggested a capacity for empathy that his business reputation had completely contradicted. The day nurse, briefed about Sterling's true identity, approached his care with obvious nervousness and deference that contrasted sharply with Victoria's natural, unaffected manner. Victoria realized that her ignorance of Sterling's identity during his most vulnerable hours had allowed her to treat him as a human being rather than a celebrity patient, probably providing better care than he would receive from staff, intimidated by his reputation and wealth. Before leaving the hospital, Victoria stopped by Sterling's room one final time to check on his progress and say goodbye. She was surprised to find him fully awake and alert, though still weak from his ordeal. When he saw her, his face lit up with genuine pleasure, and he reached out to take her hand in gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, "for treating me like a person instead of a problem. I don't think I've experienced that kind of care in decades." Victoria accepted his thanks graciously while reminding him that excellent patient care was simply her job and her calling. She encouraged him to focus on his recovery and to take advantage of this opportunity to reassess his priorities and relationships. As she prepared to leave, Sterling asked if he could see her again during his recovery, not as a patient requesting special treatment, but as someone who had found unexpected human connection during his darkest hour. In the days that followed, Sterling's recovery progressed steadily under the continued care of Victoria and her colleagues. But more significant than his physical healing was the apparent transformation in his outlook and priorities. He used his time in the hospital to reflect on his life choices, his impact on others, and the emptiness of his previous existence focused solely on wealth accumulation and corporate dominance. Victoria continued visiting Sterling during her shifts, not as his assigned nurse, but as someone who had become genuinely invested in his complete recovery, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Their conversations revealed a man who was grappling seriously with the consequences of his past actions and searching for ways to make amends for the harm he had caused. He spoke about wanting to use his remaining resources to help working families rather than exploit them. When Sterling was finally discharged from the hospital, he made an unprecedented announcement that shocked the business world. He would be donating his remaining personal wealth to establish a foundation supporting healthcare workers, single parents, and families affected by corporate layoffs. He specifically credited Victoria's compassionate care and authentic human connection with showing him what truly mattered in life. The fearsome billionaire who had collapsed alone behind a dumpster was emerging as an advocate for the very people he had once exploited. Victoria's impact on Sterling's transformation extended far beyond their hospital interactions. He hired her as the director of his new foundation, offering her a salary that would provide security for her family, while allowing her to continue caring for others on a much larger scale. Their unlikely friendship, born from a moment of crisis when she didn't know who he was, had created ripples of positive change that would affect thousands of lives. The story of the fearsome billionaire's collapse and redemption became a powerful reminder that crisis can create opportunities for transformation, that authentic human connection transcends social status, and that sometimes the most important healing happens not to our bodies, but to our souls. Victoria's compassionate care during Sterling's darkest hour had saved more than his life. It had saved his humanity and given him a chance to use his remaining years for good rather than harm.